I never imagined that one simple decision would turn my peaceful neighborhood into a battlefield. It all started when I decided to launch my boat on the lake that I owned. But just minutes later, my peaceful morning was interrupted by the sound of sirens. The HOA! Yes, the HOA had called the cops on me. They claimed I was breaking the rules, but I wasn't about to back down. Little did they know, this was just the beginning of a fight they were never prepared for. What happened next would change everything and leave them scrambling for cover. But could one person really take on the power of the HOA? Stick around to find out.
For years, Jason had lived in the kind of neighborhood that felt more like a sanctuary than just a place to call home. Nestled in the quiet suburbs, his house stood at the end of a tree-lined cul-de-sac, tucked away from the chaos of the world. It wasn't just the location that made Jason love it here, it was the peace. The mornings, with birds chirping and the sun filtering through the trees, felt like a personal escape. It was the kind of place where neighbors waved as they passed by, the occasional barbecue on a summer evening, kids riding bikes down the block. Jason had always considered himself a laid-back guy. He wasn't one to rock the boat, literally or figuratively. He'd worked hard for everything he had. His small but cozy home, his car, and his boat, which he'd recently fixed up after years of collecting dust in the garage. The lake behind his house was the one thing that made him feel truly connected to nature. He'd dreamed of taking his boat out for months, but it wasn't until that fateful Saturday morning that he finally had the chance. Jason stood on his back porch, cup of coffee in hand, staring out over the tranquil lake. It had been a long week. Work had been stressful, the weather had been miserable, and he'd barely had time to relax. But now,
as Jason steered the boat further into the lake, he noticed something odd. His neighbor, Mrs. Jensen, standing at the edge of her backyard, staring directly at him. She wasn't waving or even smiling. No, she was glaring. Jason tried to shake it off, assuming she was just watching, maybe curious about the noise. But then, the sound of sirens, distant but growing closer, began to slice through the quiet morning air. Jason frowned, his grip tightening on the boat's steering wheel. He could barely make out the flashing lights in the distance, cutting through the trees along the main road. The sirens grew louder, and Jason's stomach sank. What was going on? Before he could process it, a car screeched to a halt near the edge of his driveway. Two police officers stepped out, their faces serious, their eyes scanning the lake. Jason's heart skipped a beat. He cut the engine, the boat drifting silently in the still water. A few seconds later, the officers were at the edge of his dock. "Sir, we've had some complaints," one of them said, his tone neutral but firm. "We need you to shut down the boat and come ashore." Jason blinked. Complaints? His mind raced. He hadn't done anything wrong. Complaints about what? He asked, his voice growing confused. "The HOA said you're in violation of the community's boating regulations. They've filed an official complaint," the officer explained. Jason's jaw dropped. His HOA? The same group of well-meaning, mostly harmless neighbors who set rules about grass height and garage door color. This was insane. He hadn't broken any rules. He had checked. His boat was well within the legal boundaries of the lake. "You've got to be kidding me," Jason muttered under his breath, shaking his head. But the officers didn't seem to be joking. The second officer pulled out a clipboard and handed it to Jason, the paper clipped neatly with an official HOA warning at the top. "Please, just comply for now, sir. You'll have a chance to contest it later," the officer said. Jason looked at the paper in disbelief, his fingers trembling as he read the words, "Violation of HOA boating policy. Unauthorized use of the community lake. Cease immediately or face further legal action." Jason's heart pounded in his chest. This was absurd. He hadn't broken any rules. He had been a model resident, paid his dues on time, followed all the guidelines, and yet here he was, facing down the full weight of the HOA over something that should have been a simple, relaxing morning. but as he turned his gaze toward the shoreline, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Mrs. Jensen was still watching, her face grim, as though she had been waiting for this moment to arrive. This wasn't just a small issue. This wasn't just about a boat or a misunderstanding. Jason had a sinking feeling in his gut that something much larger was about to unfold. Something that would change everything, and it all began with a single phone call. The boat incident was just the beginning. Jason thought it was a misunderstanding, a simple glitch in the system, but he was wrong. After that morning, the HOA seemed to take an unhealthy interest in his every move. At first, it was subtle. A letter here, a reminder there. Friendly reminders, they called them, to ensure he was complying with all the rules. But Jason quickly realized these weren't just friendly nudges. They were the first shots fired in a campaign of harassment that would slowly choke out his peace of mind. It started with the mailbox. Jason had never thought much about it, just a standard, unremarkable black box attached to a post at the edge of his driveway. But 2 weeks after the boat incident, he received the first of many notices. It was a crisp, official-looking letter from the HOA with bold red letters across the top. Violation of HOA regulations. Mailbox discrepancy. Jason read the letter twice. His mailbox had no damage, no decoration, nothing that stood out in any way. The letter went on to state that the mailbox was non-compliant with the community standards. The HOA's official colors, Jason learned, were mustard yellow and navy blue, and for reasons Jason couldn't quite grasp, his simple black mailbox violated some hidden color code that had been buried deep within the HOA's approved design guidelines. He had to repaint it immediately. If he didn't, he would face a fine. A fine for a mailbox. The absurdity of it left him shaking his head, but he figured it was just another quirk of suburban life. So, he complied, repainted the mailbox in the approved colors, and hoped the HOA would finally leave him alone, but that was only the beginning. The real battle was yet to come. It wasn't long before Jason found himself receiving more letters, this time for things that seemed increasingly bizarre. A small garden gnome he had placed in his front yard. It violated the HOA's yard ornament policy. His bird bath, too. Technically, a violation of the non-functional object rule. Jason had barely even noticed these things, trivial items that had never once seemed like they might be the center of a dispute. But now, with each letter, the frustration grew. The fines piled up, too. Every violation came with an attached fee, a small fine, but enough to make Jason feel like he was slowly being worn down, financially and emotionally. And then came the noise complaint. It was a Saturday afternoon when Jason decided to finally have a few friends over for a barbecue. Nothing too crazy, just a couple of beers, some burgers on the grill, and a little music to set the mood. The kind of thing every homeowner does at least once in the summer. But after just an hour of casual music and conversation, he was shocked to receive a knock at his door. It was a pair of uniformed officers. "Are you Jason?" one of the officers asked. Jason was caught off guard. Yes. Can I help you? We've received a noise complaint from the HOA. They've stated you're violating community noise ordinances. We're going to have to ask you to turn off the music and keep it down, the officer said, his voice neutral but firm. Jason was stunned. He had barely cranked the speakers up past level 3, and the party was small, just a few neighbors, most of them laughing at how ridiculous this was getting. But it's the middle of the afternoon, and my windows are closed, Jason protested. The officer didn't seem interested in hearing excuses. Sorry, sir. We're just following orders. This is the second complaint we've had about your music this month. Jason's head was spinning. 2 complaints in 1 month? He hadn't even heard from anyone else. He'd lived in the neighborhood for 5 years and had never once gotten a noise complaint. But now, the HOA had weaponized every little complaint, twisting them into a campaign of constant surveillance. By now, Jason's frustration was bubbling over. He'd tried talking to the HOA's representative, Mrs. Palmer, who'd lived next door for decades. At first, she had been cordial, but the conversation quickly soured when he mentioned his boat. She had coldly reminded him that the HOA had every right to enforce its rules, and that even minor violations could lead to significant fines if ignored. "I'm just trying to keep the neighborhood in order," she had told him, giving him a sharp smile that made him feel like he was the problem. Jason was no longer confused. This wasn't about rules. This wasn't about property value or safety. This was about control. The HOA had decided he was their target, and they weren't going to stop until they broke him. It all came to a head one Friday morning when Jason woke up to find a note attached to his door. The letter was short, but its message was chilling. "Final warning, if you do not address the following violations immediately, we will begin legal proceedings. Mailbox color, non-compliant front yard ornament, illegal plasimentois violations, ongoing complaint boat launching incident, illegal use of the community lake without HOA approval. Failure to resolve these issues by the end of the week will result in a lawsuit." Jason was livid. Lawsuit? He was being sued over a mailbox? A gnome? A barbecue? The anger built in his chest. He walked to his driveway, his eyes scanning the familiar scene of his peaceful home. The serene lake, his boat docked at the edge. Now a distant memory of calm and freedom. He had never felt more trapped. The HOA's reach was suffocating him. Every decision, every small action seemed to be under their microscope. But this time, Jason didn't just take the letter lying down. No, something had shifted in him. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every homeowner who'd ever been bullied into submission. Every resident who had been worn down by the constant hum of petty rules and fines. Jason knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let this go. He began to research. He reached out to attorneys, dug into HOA laws, found loopholes and gray areas that the HOA had clearly ignored. And as he uncovered more and more, a plan began to form in his mind, a plan to strike back, not just to defend his rights, but to turn the tables completely. But before he could make a move, the HOA dropped a bombshell. They had scheduled a meeting with his neighbors to discuss his habitual violations and recommended that he be forced to sell his property under threat of escalating legal action. It was then that Jason realized just how far they were willing to go. The only question now was, how far was he willing to go? Jason had reached his breaking point. Every letter, every fine, every ridiculous complaint had brought him closer to the edge. But when the HOA decided to take it a step further, scheduling a community-wide meeting to discuss his habitual violations, he realized they weren't just targeting him anymore. They were trying to make an example out of him. And that was something he could no longer ignore. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening at the local community center. Jason had been dreading it for days, knowing full well that this was no ordinary HOA gathering. It was a showdown. The stakes had never been higher. As he entered the packed room, Jason could feel the eyes of his neighbors on him. Mrs. Palmer, the HOA president, was already at the front, standing tall at the podium, her glasses perched on her nose, a look of triumph in her eyes. She wasn't just the leader of the HOA, she was its enforcer. And in that moment, she looked like someone who had already won. The room fell silent when she saw Jason walk in. It wasn't a welcoming silence, it was the kind of silence that precedes a storm. Jason took a deep breath, steadying himself. He couldn't let fear or anger control him now. This was his moment to strike back, to stand up not only for himself but for every other resident who had silently suffered under the HOA's iron grip. Mrs. Palmer smiled, though it was the kind of smile that sent a chill through the room. "Ah, Mr. Harris, you finally decided to join us," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Please, have a seat. I'm sure you'll want to hear all about your violations." Jason didn't sit. He stood there, facing the room of people, his neighbors, many of whom he had never even met, waiting to see what would happen next. "Let's get right to the point," Mrs. Palmer continued. "Mr. Harris has become a recurring problem in our community. Not only has he repeatedly violated our noise and property guidelines, but now he's challenging the very rules that keep this neighborhood safe. His blatant disregard for the HOA's authority cannot be ignored. We have discussed this matter thoroughly, and we believe that it's time for Mr. Harris to sell his property. There is no place for someone who refuses to follow the rules in this neighborhood." The room murmured in agreement. Some people nodded. Others avoided eye contact, as though they could feel the tension thickening in the air. But there was one voice in the back of the room that cut through the murmur. "Wait a minute." It was Carl, a neighbor who had lived across the street from Jason for years. Carl wasn't known for being outspoken, but he had always been kind to Jason when they'd passed each other on the sidewalk. "Is this really necessary?" Carl's question was a small act of defiance. But in a room full of people who were either too afraid or too indifferent to speak out, it was enough to make Jason's heart skip a beat. Mrs. Palmer's smile faltered for a second, but she quickly regained her composure. "Yes, Carl, it's necessary. Mr. Harris has been a disruption, and the HOA's role is to maintain the integrity of this community. We cannot allow one person to ruin the harmony we've worked so hard to create." Jason felt his chest tighten. This was it, the battle he'd been dreading, but also preparing for. He couldn't let them do this to him, not after everything they had put him through. "Actually," Jason said, stepping forward, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity, "I think it's time for you to hear the full story. You've all been hearing one side, Mrs. Palmer's side, but I haven't had a chance to speak. And I think it's only fair that you hear the truth." A few people exchanged glances. Mrs. Palmer's lips tightened into a thin line. "You think this is the time to play the victim, Mr. Harris?" She scoffed. "This is a meeting of the HOA. We're here to discuss facts, not personal feelings." "I'm not playing the victim," Jason shot back. "I'm telling you how things really are. I've been here for years, and I've always followed the rules. But when you start using your power to harass people for petty reasons like a mailbox or a garden gnome, it's not about the rules anymore. It's about control. It's about power. And it's about time you stopped pretending that you're here to make this place a better neighborhood." The room was silent. Jason could feel every eye on him, but this time, he wasn't afraid. He was angry. And for the first time in months, he felt like he had the power to push back. "You know," Jason continued, "I started out trying to be a good neighbor. I followed every rule, paid my dues on time, and I did everything you asked of me. But then came the boat. Then came the mailbox. Then came the noise complaints. And you didn't stop. You didn't even give me a chance to fix things. Instead, you kept piling on more rules, more fines, more harassment. You pushed and pushed until you tried to force me out of my own home. Well, I've had enough." Mrs. Palmer's eyes flashed with annoyance. "You're making a scene, Mr. Harris." "I'm not making a scene," Jason retorted. "I'm making a stand." The room buzzed with tension. Jason could see the uncertainty in some of the faces now. A few people were looking at him with a mix of sympathy and disbelief. But Mrs. Palmer wasn't backing down. "Mr. Harris, you are out of line," she said, her voice cold and final. "You've been warned. We have already taken the legal steps to ensure that you comply. You've left us no choice." Jason could feel the weight of her words hanging in the air. This was it. The fight was no longer just about the boat or the mailbox. This was about him keeping his home, about his rights. And as much as Mrs. Palmer wanted to make him the villain, Jason knew the truth was on his side. "Actually," Jason said, pulling out a thick folder of documents from his bag, "I've done a little research of my own." He slammed the folder onto the table. And I think you'll find that your so-called rules are not only unreasonable, they're actually illegal in many cases. Gasps echoed through the room. Jason opened the folder, revealing pages of research, legal precedents, and quotes from the HOA's own bylaws, information he had painstakingly collected over the past few weeks. He had met with a lawyer, and it turned out that many of the HOA's actions were not just petty, they were legally questionable. He flipped to a page. For example, according to state law, the HOA can't impose fines for arbitrary reasons. And it certainly can't make a person sell their home just because they don't like them. These fines you've been levying against me, they're not just unfair, they're unenforceable, Mrs. Palmer's face went pale. She stammered, this is completely out of line. Mr. Harris. Jason leaned forward, his eyes locked with hers. You've been abusing your power for years, Mrs. Palmer, and I think the time has come for you to face the consequences. The room was stunned into silence. For a moment, no one moved. Jason could see the conflict in the eyes of his neighbors. They had been complicit for so long, but now they were seeing the truth. They were beginning to understand just how far the HOA had overstepped, but before anyone could speak, Jason raised his hand. I don't want your apologies, Mrs. Palmer, he said, his voice low but firm. I don't need your approval. I'm taking this to court, and when I win, not only will I get to keep my home, but I'll make sure no one else here ever has to deal with the tyranny you've imposed. This ends now. He turned to the room. And if anyone here wants to join me, you're more than welcome. Because if we don't stand up to this, they'll come after you next. Jason's declaration hung in the air like a challenge, like a battle cry. The room was electric with the weight of his words. The decision had been made, and now the only question left was, would the HOA crumble, or would Jason have to go even further to make sure the battle was won? When Jason walked out of that HOA meeting, his heart was pounding like a drum. He had slammed the folder of evidence onto the table, exposed their hypocrisy, and declared he was ready to take them to court. But that was only the first blow. What came next would determine whether his bold stand was a victory or just the beginning of an even bigger nightmare. The following weeks felt like a blur. The HOA, cornered and humiliated in front of the entire neighborhood, didn't retreat quietly. Instead, they doubled down. Letters came almost daily now. New violations appeared out of thin air. His lawn was half an inch too tall, his recycling bin was too visible from the street, and his car, parked in his own driveway, was an eyesore. Each notice came with threats of escalating fines. Each fine came with the looming reminder that the HOA had already started the process of suing him. But what the board didn't realize was that Jason had already armed himself with more than evidence. He had built a strategy with the help of his lawyer. He filed a countersuit against the HOA, citing harassment, abuse of power, and violation of state HOA statutes. His attorney had warned him it wouldn't be easy. HOAs were notorious for dragging cases out, hoping the homeowner would cave first. But Jason was done bending. For the first time in months, he felt the fire of determination burning hotter than the fear. With the help of his lawyer, he filed a countersuit against the HOA, citing harassment, abuse of power, and violation of state HOA statutes. His attorney had warned him it wouldn't be easy. HOAs were notorious for dragging cases out, hoping the homeowner would cave first. But Jason was done bending. For the first time in months, he felt the fire of determination burning hotter than the fear, and the neighbors were beginning to notice. It started small. Carl, the man who had spoken up in the meeting, stopped by Jason's driveway one evening. He held a letter in his hand, one from the HOA. They're coming after me too, Carl admitted, shaking his head. They said my roof tiles aren't the right shade of brown. Can you believe that? Jason could believe it. He'd been through it all already. But what mattered was this: he wasn't alone anymore. Carl wasn't the only one. Within weeks, more neighbors began reaching out. Some admitted they had been silently dealing with their own ridiculous fines for years. Others confessed they had been too afraid to speak up at meetings, worried the HOA would retaliate if they made waves, and suddenly, what had once been Jason versus the HOA began to look more like Jason leading a growing movement. The court date arrived on a crisp morning, the kind of morning Jason used to enjoy on his porch with a cup of coffee. But now, standing outside the courthouse, he felt the weight of the entire neighborhood pressing down on him. Reporters had caught wind of the case. It wasn't often that an HOA was publicly challenged, especially in such a dramatic fashion. A local news van parked out front, cameras pointed toward the steps. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. The HOA's lawyers sat stiff and polished, flipping through thick binders. Mrs. Palmer was there too, her face set in stone. Though Jason noticed her eyes darting nervously toward the cameras, Jason and his lawyer laid everything bare: the unnecessary fines, the harassment, the illegal attempts to force him to sell his home. They presented the stack of letters, the recordings of officers showing up at his door over bogus complaints, and most importantly, the state laws that clearly outlined the HOA had overstepped its authority. For hours, the courtroom listened to the back and forth. Jason sat silently as his lawyer dismantled every accusation. By the end of the day, the judge leaned forward, steepling his hands. His voice was calm, but his words carried the weight of finality. This HOA has engaged in a clear pattern of harassment against the plaintiff. Many of the fines levied are unenforceable, and the attempt to pressure the homeowner into selling his property was unlawful. The court rules in favor of Mr. Harris. The gavel struck. Jason's chest felt like it might burst. He had won, but the victory wasn't just his. The ruling didn't just throw out Jason's fines. It forced the HOA to pay damages for harassment. It ordered the board to cease any future fines without documented, lawful cause. And perhaps most devastating to Mrs. Palmer, it opened the door for the residents to call a special election to replace the HOA board entirely. The news spread like wildfire. By the time Jason got home, half the neighborhood already knew. People who had barely spoken to him before now came by with smiles, handshakes, even congratulations. For years, they had lived under the HOA's thumb, quietly swallowing rules they knew were unfair, afraid of what might happen if they resisted. Jason's fight had shown them they weren't powerless, and just a few weeks later, the board that had ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist was gone. Mrs. Palmer resigned in disgrace after the court ruling. Several other board members quietly stepped down. In their place, the community voted in new leadership, people who wanted to manage the neighborhood fairly, not terrorize it. For Jason, life slowly returned to normal. He repainted his mailbox whatever color he wanted. He put the garden gnome back in his yard. He invited friends over for barbecues without worrying about cops showing up at his door. And on quiet mornings, he took his boat out on the lake he had owned all along without a single interruption. But the experience had changed him forever. Jason realized that what he had endured wasn't just about petty fines or a power-hungry HOA president. It was about standing up when people in power try to intimidate those beneath them. It was about not letting fear dictate your life. And it was about showing others that one voice, backed by truth and determination, can inspire an entire community to rise. In the months that followed, Jason's story spread far beyond his neighborhood. Local news outlets covered it. Online forums buzzed with discussions about HOA abuse. People from across the country reached out, sharing their own horror stories and thanking Jason for giving them hope. His fight had become bigger than just one man versus his HOA. It had become a symbol of what could happen when ordinary people refused to be pushed around. Jason didn't consider himself a hero. He was just a man who wanted to live in peace, who wanted to enjoy his home without being harassed. But by standing his ground, he had done something remarkable. He had broken the cycle of silence that allowed the HOA's abuse to thrive, and in the end, that was the most powerful victory of all. While rules can keep a neighborhood orderly, and HOAs can serve a purpose, they should never become weapons to control and punish. They should never strip people of the simple joys of homeownership. Jason's story was a reminder, a warning. Even that power unchecked will always lead to abuse.so. The next time you hear about an HOA enforcing some outrageous rule, or a neighbor being fined for something as ridiculous as the color of their front door, remember this: Jason didn't just survive his HOA, he defeated it. And it all started with one phone call. The phone call that was supposed to break him, but instead lit the spark that burned their power to the ground. This was today's secret. Every shed hides a secret, but remember, the shed never stays quiet for long. Until next time, Secret Shed Stories. What would you have done if your HOA tried to force you out of your own home?
What would you have done if your HOA tried to force you out of your own home? Do you think Jason went too far or not far enough? Have you ever dealt with an HOA that abused its power? Do HOAs keep neighborhoods safe, or are they just a way to control homeowners? If this happened to you, would you fight back or walk away?